Hello, everyone. I'm James Green. Welcome to Google. Thanks for bringing some fantastic weather down here in Mountain View. Glad you all made it out for Cardi for us Northern Californians. We have a great program here today. I won't spend a lot of time talking about it. Our moderator, Jacob Ward, I'm going to do a book plug, who longtime journalist, editor-in-chief of Popular Science and MSNBC and NBC. The book is The Loop, How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. What we'll take through the speakers. We thought, what a great chance to talk about what's happening in artificial intelligence and what policymakers and folks in the Asia Pacific are thinking about the future. And so we've got a great panelist here to kind of talk through those things. Please, hopefully be interactive, and over to you, Jacob.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. These gatherings have been really interesting for me just because the horsepower in the room is always so enormous. People bring a huge amount of expertise to these discussions. So thanks for being here, everybody. So I'll just run through each person. They have long and storied backgrounds, but I'm not going to give them all of the long story that they deserve. Amlan Mohanty here is an independent lawyer and policy advisor and researcher. He is currently a fellow at Carnegie, India, and he also just recently was the lead writer on the AI governance guidelines that India released, which is going to be a focus of our conversation here today, which is very lucky for us. As a news guy, I love breaking news, and we've got the guy to talk about the breaking news, so that's great. Ellie Sakhaee leads the AI and emerging tech policy practice here at Google and has a lot of really interesting background in both research and business and thinking about that. And then Russell Wald here is the executive director of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence and has been thinking very deeply about these topics for a long time as well. As was mentioned, I'm Jacob Ward. I cover technology. I've been covering AI, God help me, for about 10 years. And I'm now a fellow at the Omidyar Network, where I'm doing a bunch of research on AI's effect on labor and mental health and policy. So, Amlan, let's start with the breaking news, which is these new AI guidelines out of India that you served as lead writer on. We were talking before we got on stage here about the degree to which India is seeking, as every country is, to balance regulation and innovation. I was very struck this year by the announcement of the transportation minister in India that they were not going to allow self-driving vehicles in India. And the explanation was that so much of the economy depends on professional drivers for employment. And so that was a case in which clearly a head of government says, we are not going to allow this breakthrough innovation for a very specific, pragmatic reason. Here, you've had to really strike a balance here, and I'm curious what the attitude among policymakers was compared to what we saw in the country's response to something like self-driving cars.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob, for that question. And firstly, thank you to the Asia Society for having me here, hosting me here. It's a real pleasure to be back. I used to work at Google many years ago, so it's a nice homecoming for me. Yeah, it's a tough question to kick us off, but I should just start by saying, on the drive here, I actually looked at a Waymo for the first time, just driving itself, and I have to say, it's pretty mind-blowing. And I can imagine any policymaker in India sitting in a car looking at that is going to be equally mind-blown, right? And that's actually when we're talking about this balance between innovation, and we need to talk about what on the other side is, right? Is it about risk mitigation? Is it about safety? Is it about guardrails? Let's leave that open. But on the innovation side, that's exactly the kind of things that India wants, that the Indian government wants. Because you're talking about India having all of this talent, engineering talent, about the infrastructure, the resources to be able to build. But what you build, you want to build a self-driving car, and you want to deploy that in the street. So that's really what that larger strategic vision is for India, to have that kind of innovation. And then, of course, you have a statement like that. And so you really have to put that into context. Why is the transportation minister saying we're a little hesitant to allow these self-driving cars? It's because there is going to be significant disruptive impact about deploying AI at scale to specific groups of people. And cab drivers, auto drivers in India are a very important demographic, right? And so if you deploy AI at scale, I don't see that in this particular issue, this is a safety risk or a risk that we had to think about, this committee had to think about as a regulatory risk, right? What are those risks? Those are risks relating to like malicious uses, right? People using AI for defamation or impersonation and so on, or discrimination risks or national security risks. None of those are actually playing out when you're deploying Waymos at scale in India. I think it's just a very specific issue around labor impact, which is a very important issue, but it's not a kind of a regulatory risk that we had to balance in that way. So when the transportation minister says, we're not going to allow Waymos or self-driving cars in India at scale, I think it's a very different kind of tension that's playing out, which we'll have to, I think, deal with in a very separate context.
And if we compare that to something like the assumption that India is going to see tremendous disruption when it comes to just the current LLMs posing an enormous existential threat to the outsourced customer service business, or any of a number of knowledge work kind of businesses that are such a big part of India's economy. How do we compare that? I mean, when you're, and I'm asking you this not just for your personal opinion, but I'm so interested to know what it was like to be in the room talking with policymakers. How do they think about this stuff? And then I promise you guys, we're going to talk to you as well.
I'll just keep this short. Look, short answer, that impact is real. Just in the last 6 months, all of the outsourcing companies, Infosys, TCS, Wipro, they've announced layoffs. And whether they're explicit or not, it is a product of some level of automation. The coding agents have gotten so good that they're doing 80% of the job that they used to do. So I think the Indian government, the key policymakers are very aware of the impact. I think, if you really dig into what's kind of in the psyche, I think they're concerned about what the data will reveal if they do kind of empirical data, like studies at scale. So you won't see a lot of studies from India about what the labor impact is, at least at a granular level, right? Like how is that ITS kind of sector going to be impacted? And I think it's a little bit, let's wait and watch. We're a little troubled by what the numbers might reveal, but we know it's an issue. That's kind of where the Indian government is at right now.
So now let's contrast and then I've done this out of order. I really want to hear you summarize some of these guidelines and what the sort of thinking was behind these. But maybe Russell, let's contrast this with some of these other places. And you guys, one of the ways that we're sort of thinking about this conversation, in our conversations ahead of meeting with you, we've talked a lot about the concept that APAC could conceivably be a sort of third way when it comes to AI regulation. Maybe it's the fourth way if you consider China the third way, so maybe that's really it. But the United States, the EU, does APAC somehow create a third way? And so as we think in the examples that we're going to think about today about what threads might come out to inform that third way, Russell, I'm wondering among the APAC countries that you've looked at, what do you think about as an interesting example?
So I would say one interesting thing here is we say the third way, if the U.S. being the laissez-faire kind of approach and Europe being much more restrictive in this sense, that actually one of the third ways I think is if we're looking at specifically the juggernaut of the room of the region being China specifically, they actually have had a unique way. So if you look at what the U.S. Has done, the U.S. has invested or kind of outsourced or allowed for their proprietary companies to have the predominant lead here on the advancement of the technology. And what you see is about probably a 6-month kind of advantage that they have, but that's it, a 6-month kind of advantage. And the U.S. has not really invested deeply in its public sector base. It has not invested in open community. But meanwhile, China demonstrates this fast capacity that they're able to do because they've deeply invested in their community, deeply invested in the public sector, and have embraced an open source community. And that's really important because what they're doing is maybe not being at that very front edge level, but they're seeding an entire ecosystem that's much more effective in this space. And I think that the US kind of got a bit of a wake-up call with DeepSeek being released just this year. Let's forget that was just this, just came out, the version that woke up the US. That is really important because that has an effect on how you have an ecosystem for innovation. Now, I'm giving two these three examples. Two of them are the frontier model developers. And the question is can another country be a frontier model developer? And I think currently, under the circumstances, no. The question is, though...
The United States, China,
yeah,
that's it.
I think for the most part, yes. If you're looking at the data and what we see here, but that said, that it gives the impression that that's the only way of AI development, when in fact, I actually think the other important way is who is going to be the applied leader, who is going to be able to have that applied effect here. We were talking earlier about Singapore and what Singapore is doing in this space. Yes, they're trying to understand the technology at a frontier level, but they actually at an applied level, it's very fascinating what they're doing and how they're really trying to integrate that into their economy. And what's interesting to me is we have, at Stanford HAI, we have a few collaborative projects with the Singaporeans and Singaporean universities. And one of them is on ambient technology. Singapore is a small country, but has a demographic problem of, like most of the world, of an aging population. But they don't have the means to import a bunch of labor to be able to help them. So they have to kind of tech their way out of some of these situations. And so we're working on projects with them on ambient technology and what that could mean in senior.
Find that. What is ambient?
Sure. Ambient technology is essentially, think of it of a hive of sensors that still try to maintain and protect privacy as best as possible, but can actually, in the hospital setting, first is where we started to look at Stanford Medicine, is in the ICU, 30% of deaths that actually happen in the ICU happen just by virtue of you being there, not what you went in for. Hospital-acquired infection being one of the number one issues. So what you could essentially do is enhance and make the ICU more secure by having a variety of sensors to be able to capture some of these, and an AI mind behind it to be able to understand what's happening in this room. Well, if you take that step further out and put it into a senior care facility, then you can actually have someone maybe age in place, but not be vulnerable to being alone or something that can happen from them in that sense. And so by allowing for that, they can actually still grow in their own home, or if ultimately that's the goal. And that's what we're working with the Singaporeans on. So there's a lot of applied opportunity here. And I think that we should not get overly focused on who's leading at the frontier level. That only wins you so much. Winning at the applied level, I think, is going to be really important. And that's one part that APAC can do a lot of.
So I'm thinking here about, and Ellie, this is going to be for you, but I'm thinking about all the different examples we are seeing emerging across APAC, right? You've got South Korea poised to pass a bunch of legislation that's, has just passed legislation that's going to go into effect in 2026. The Philippines acting quickly on a AI disinformation law. Australia, kind of an outlier, but being very, much more, I would say, European, much more restrictive. They've just banned social media for kids under 16 and seem to be leaning more towards something in that vein. Ellie, when you sort of look across this landscape, are there common threads that for a company like Google is, I don't know, is there a, I don't even know quite how to ask this, but like, is there a kind of, must have, nice to have kind of way of looking across the landscape of these things? And I guess the big question is has a commonality emerged at all that for you guys is what you would either hope for or hope against?
Thank you for that question. I think more than commonality, let's first talk about the disparity of what we are seeing across the APAC region. Russell talked about Singapore. Singapore's approach as pillars that not only thinks of is not only focused on regulation, but also on building the ecosystem, on capacity building, on supporting the startups in the ecosystem to provide them tools, provide them frameworks. For example, they provide them a tool that is Gen AI Explorer, and that allows startups to identify what kind of tools exist out there that could be useful. They offer something that is called CTO as a service that helps startups that are not tech savvy to kind of catch up and use AI in how they want to offer services. So they have a lot of support for enterprises, in addition to thinking about not regulating, but also thinking about how can they use sectoral regulations that exist and apply them to application of AI rather than kind of like a horizontal law that applies to AI as a technology. So A, using the sectoral applications, B, supporting the ecosystem, C, supporting the talent, which is kind of in today's world, it's very important to build this pipeline of talent that is interdisciplinary. And the programs that Singapore, for example, offers is that they take scientists and put them in working with SMEs and engineers to kind of support them learn new tools, support them use AI in their scientific research. So if you think about Singapore's approach, it's kind of a broad way of not only how can we regulate, but how can we support our ecosystem to kind of use this wave. On the other hand, you see countries like Vietnam, for example. Vietnam has a draft law that is even more stringent than EU AI Act, that has elements that are kind of like has strict fines, strict liability requirements. So kind of like on the other side of the spectrum, we see Vietnam that is kind of going even one step further than the EU AI Act. And then countries like India and Japan take a very different approach, that take the approach of being pro-innovation. And while they are also thinking about applying the existing laws to applications of AI and taking that risk-based approach, they observe the fact that AI brings a lot of opportunity for the society, and what they want to be AI first. So if it's really a spectrum, and I think at the two ends of the spectrum, on one end we have Vietnam that is going one step further than EU AI Act, and on the other end of the spectrum we have Japan that is taking a very pro-innovation, pro-growth approach to AI. So to answer your question in terms of commonality, I think one thing that is present in most of these approaches or frameworks to AI is observing the fact that all these countries need interoperable frameworks. And the reason for interoperability is A, they enable their businesses to offer their services to overseas countries, and also their citizens can kind of can use the best of class services in their country. So I think that thread of observing interoperable frameworks, interoperable regulations, and is hopefully give us the opportunity to not have the situation with fragmented regulations across the region, but also these kind of align with international norms, aligning with international standards. So hopefully that we will see more of that in the region.
Can I make
go ahead, please.
One quick point? I think it's really important to recognize how you regulate, and there's different ways to regulate. And let me give you an example. There's upstream and downstream in terms of regulation. You can, in one sense, regulate the model developer itself and say, you must develop according to this, and we hear a lot about what's being talked about in 10 to the 26th or 10 to the 24th in terms of model of compute used. And there's just lots of different ways of how the model developer is regulating. But then there's the deployer itself. And that is where I think you will experience a lot of the harms and the issues downstream and the effect on that. That's where also some existing regulation in most countries already can be applied in some of these sense. The question is what's going to be effective, what's science-based, right? I think there's a lack of, particularly on the upstream part, not much in the way of science that drives these kinds of policy policy proposals. And what was interesting is in the India proposal, they actually say specifically more on the downstream is probably more important and effective, because you might actually hinder advancement and not solve for what you wanted to solve for in the first place. And that's one of these challenges. So there's a distinction on regulation on how we regulate.
And Ellie, you mentioned this notion of seeing sectoral regulations as opposed to a carte blanche, or a greenfield horizontal AI regulation. And I'm assuming you would, that Google's position is that existing sectoral regulations can, in many cases, account for the needs. Make that case for us. Why is that the case, given that this is as Google and all the other foundational companies have said, such a transformative technology. Why is sectoral regulation the answer?
I think no.
Yes, there we go.
Yes, a case for that. So technology is a means to something, right? So the goal of regulation is to minimize the harm. At the end of the day, the goal is to maximize the benefits and minimize the harm. So if you're regulating the AI technology by itself, is like, I don't want to have road accidents, so let's regulate the engine of a car, and therefore my cars will not go speed more than 25 miles per hour. On the other hand, the regulation should be on the speed of the car, that it can go up to this number. And we have race cars that are in a safe situation and they can go as fast as they want, right? So regulating the technology itself has that impact of regulating a piece that is, the impact of it is actually something that has to be taken care of if we want to address harms. So that car example could be an analogy for regulating the model itself. Number two, the issue is that when you regulate the underlying technology, and especially the underlying technology being so fast evolving, then you end up with a situation that you regulate something that you goes through this whole legislative process and it takes years, and by the time that regulation goes into effect, that it's actually obsolete because the underlying technology has moved on. So the question is, what is it that we want to regulate? If we want to protect our citizens from the harms that are possible from this technology, we should regulate in a way that is technology neutral. And if tomorrow the technology changes, then we are still regulating against those harms. And also, it is timely enough to not be obsolete right after the technology has evolved. I hope that kind of answers your question. Mm-hmm. Why not the technology regulation?
Yeah, and so Amlan, if people in India were to, if policymakers in India were to hear Ellie, if she were in the room with them making that case, what is the response? I mean, what's the feeling? I saw you have these 7 sutras built into, these guiding principles built into it, and one of them is, of course, innovation before restraint. So I'm assuming that policymakers there would feel the same way in some form.
Yeah, look, there are lots of interesting threads in what Russell and Ellie just spoke about. But innovation before cautionary restraint is one of the many sutras. But if it's helpful, maybe I'll just kind of talk about what I think in the Indian approach is what is unique. I think based on what I'm hearing, I think one is just that when you're thinking about AI governance, I think the instinct is often to think about regulation. And what we've tried to do in this particular framework is to think about governance in a more expansive way, which is to think about, yes, of course, policy and regulation, but it's about capacity building. It's about adoption. It's about diffusion. So if you actually look at what the governance framework talks about, there are these 6 pillars, right? It is about how can we have policy frameworks that encourage deployment, that encourage adoption, that encourage investment. So I think having a more expansive view of governance that's not focused on regulation, I think is one interesting, unique way in which India has approached this. 2 is this question of do you need sectoral laws or standalone laws? We discussed this at length in our committee deliberations, and it was very clear that India is not going to adopt a separate AI law. Not in the way that the EU has done, not in the way that Vietnam is doing. And we're very, confident in this approach. India has a very complex system of laws and regulations, starting with the constitution, which itself actually can regulate a lot of issues around AI, whether it's free speech and issues around discrimination. There are very strong, robust frameworks from a democratically built constitution, and then flowing down to kind of statutory frameworks around consumer protection, around intellectual property, around information technology, around competition. There are existing regulations that can apply. So we don't need a separate kind of AI law. The third is, I think, relating to what Russell was saying, is that where are these risks emerging in the Indian context, right? We're regulating, or if we're thinking about policy and regulation, we care about what the relevance in the Indian context is, and it's actually not the development risks, right? We're not, like Russell was saying, India is not building foundational models. We don't care about frontier safety risks, right? So actually for us, it's post-deployment risks. It's about bias mitigation at population scale. And that's what we need to be thinking about. It's like cultural representation of the 22 official languages in India, right? So those are the kinds of issues that we really need to be thinking about that matter for India. So it's really focused on that. And then the fourth, I think, is thinking about some of these things that we agree on as a society, cross-culturally, which we're calling kind of responsible AI principles or ethical principles around fairness, non-discrimination, and so on. I think we all agree on that. I think, as we discussed today, is like, how do you implement those principles? And I think what the India approach is to say, let's start with seeing if industry can self-regulate. So there's a very heavy emphasis on voluntary risk mitigation, right? Industry codes, code of ethics, right? And this has been happening through multilateral regional frameworks over a period of time. And we're saying, let's wait and watch. Let's see if this works. And if there is a market failure, if there is a gap, the Indian government will come in and intervene. And that's actually already happened. Just 2 weeks ago, the Indian government issued these draft regulations on deepfakes, essentially on synthetic media, because it found that that industry was not doing enough. Right. So on deepfakes, there is a new regulatory proposal which is about increasing transparency, about screening, monitoring content. We can argue on the merits of the specific proposal, but that's an example of how you start with voluntary measures. If there's a gap, you enforce legally binding rules, not a separate AI law. And then finally, I think this is really important is to have an institutional architecture to ensure accountability. Right? Who is going to actually monitor this space? And you need to have robust institutions to do that. And traditional institutions might not operate, right? Traditional consumer protection bodies might not be enough. You need to have robust institutions which have the technical expertise, who understand both the capabilities and the risks. And so there's a proposal in our governance framework for a new AI governance group, a technology policy expert committee that can advise this group, and of course an AI safety institute that's thinking about, like I said, post-deployment risks in the Indian context. So I think an important institutional framework is also something to think about.
There's one of the sutras in the guidelines is trust. Is trying to sort of, and it's the first one, trying to create the idea of trust in the technology, in the institutions using it. And I had a funny conversation last week with a German creator of basically a blockchain-based automated mediation service, essentially, a way in which you don't need lawyers. You use an AI system that has been preloaded with each party's perspective, and then it'll come to its own conclusion through a bunch of anonymous juries. Anyway, I could go on and on about how crazy this thing is. Anyway, it was very interesting. And she was explaining it in this way that it was clear she had been mostly talking to German audiences about this, who clearly were absolutely fine with it. Sounds great, because there is such institutional trust in that culture around that stuff. She told it to a room full of American lawyers that I was part of. Everybody burst into laughter, basically, because it's such a crazy idea to Americans, the idea that you would entrust some anonymous automated system with your divorce or anything else, right? And I'm curious, and I'd like it from any of you, right? This notion of trust culturally, whether this is, to what extent we should be thinking about this. I mean, we've already seen that there is a cultural gap. A report just recently came out showing that there is all sorts of caste bias in large language models in India. You ask it, should a Brahmin or a Dalit get the job? It'll say Brahmin most of the time. So there's clearly some problems with a Western-built system not having adequate cultural sensitivity coming across. But I also, just generally speaking, thinking about trust. This is a technology that really requires a lot of trust. And I'm curious what thoughts any of you have about just like, how do we think about that in this context?
Little microphone. What I would say in terms of, for me, when I think of trust, is there's a couple of things. First, the accuracy of the systems is one of the first layers. So hallucination is just, can't be an acceptable part. We have to have accuracy to some extent. The bias issues that you refer to. But there's also the third part of, these are generative systems and they have an output. And what is that output? And that output can be culturally subjective. It can be subjective. You don't have to go outside of California even to find different viewpoints that you would find, or even outside the Bay Area, to find different viewpoints on what's coming out from some of these systems. That's going to be a perennial challenge for this, because it being so subjective is quite difficult. And what might be my personal view or preference to having something might be completely different to somebody who is in another region. So that's a challenge. You mentioned the issues about culture and language, and we have done deep analysis on this, and we do see lots of issues related to this, lower resource languages and the challenges that they have and being represented in this context, in this environment.
And if you were going to summarize those problems, how they manifest or how big a problem they are?
It's representation. I want to be able to be seen that I'm in the system, or that I actually can have the proper dialogue with it that I need to have. But one other important thing that I want to say here is what is ironic, and what we see, because I'm part of the AI Index, which is an annual report that's published about the growth of AI and what's happening. We measure year over year public opinion. And what we see consistently is if you're from a Western industrialized country, you have a very low optimistic view towards AI. The difference, the juxtaposition between the two, if you were to look at China, it's 82% positive rating. In the US, it's 36% positive rating. It's very interesting. We don't analyze why. I have lots of hypotheses on this. If people want to ask me after, I can share that. But where will that trust be found is also very interesting in a population's relationship with technology as a whole. So it's kind of a fascinating thing what happens here. But trust needs to happen across the board. And how do you create a groundwork for trust? Accuracy, inclusion, and that you're not being biased out in some capacity.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. We could go on, I think, an entire session. But I talk about trust in three ways. I think it's about at a personal level, at a societal level, and a geopolitical level. And I think this is an evolving dynamic space. But in a personal level, we're seeing people trust AI chatbots in ways that we had never imagined, right? For therapy, or for medical device, for medical information, for legal advice. So I think there's just something really interesting happening there. And I think we really need to think a lot more about what's driving that trust. Who are you really trusting? It's not the chatbot, right? Bruce Schneer, this security expert, says it's actually you're placing the trust on the company that's building a chatbot. And so there's like an illusion of trust about, what exactly you're placing trust on. So at a personal level, I think it's really interesting. We should just kind of track that. At a societal level, it's exactly what you said. Are you trusting the institutions around which, this entire ecosystem is developing? Like if something were to go wrong, are you're confident that there will be, some form of grievance redressal? And then at a geopolitical level, and we haven't gotten into it in this discussion, is this entire question around sovereignty, right? Which I think you were alluding to, Russell, which is, these questions of who's building the model, is your culture being preserved, linguistic diversity, cultural representation. And so you're seeing increasingly, at least in the APAC region, movement towards building your own sovereign AI models. And I think that's coming a little bit from some potential distrust or mistrust about in a geopolitical context. And I think that's what digging into as well.
I would add two things to that. One is that Russell mentioned representation. And for representation, for these models to be representative of the target audience, yes, of course, one of the number one things is how can we create that representation in the model is with more data. And one of the things that, for example, Government of India has done is that they have a repository that collects public data and kind of put them together in a central repository that is very beneficial for developing models that are adapted for that specific context. So that's number one, is the representation in the outcome comes from the representation in the data that is available. And there is a lot of work at Google to kind of build multilingual models, have representation across even dialects within a certain language. So there's a lot of effort within Google to kind of represent that diversity of our customers in the products that we offer. And the second piece that I think APAC has done a great job on is how do we identify these gaps? One of the things that we do for testing the models is red teaming. So one of the very interesting things that APAC region has done is that they have formed a multilateral red teaming group coming from 10 countries within the region. And these researchers basically red team the models with that cultural aspect from their perspective within that culture. So that you identify the issue and then you go back and fix the issue. So having that representation even within testers is very important to kind of like figure out the issues and go solve them. I stopped there. I think Russell had some.
So we'll take questions from the audience in just a second. Let me ask one final one here, which is just what you guys are going to be watching in the next couple of years, the next year, let's say, in terms of countries to watch, examples to watch. Vietnam for me is a really interesting one. I'll be really curious to see how that works out. I'm always most curious to see who gets the harshest punishment first and what that test case tells us about how regulations are going to work, right? But I'm curious from any of you, it doesn't have to be all of you, but from any of you, what will you be watching for in the next 6 to 8 months?
Yeah, maybe I can go first. And a bit of a plug. This is kind of 2 research papers that I'm working on, but it's also what's occupying my mind, but I think relevant for this discussion. One is a paper on kind of AI governance in South Asia. And that's not Southeast Asia. It's South Asia because I feel like that's very understudied and underdeveloped. So I'm talking countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh. And really the idea is, as I'm kind of researching this, I find that there's just such convergence in what all of these people want to do, right, with AI. It's really about applying AI for kind of, it's a use case orientation. It's applying, you're not just building AI for the sake of it, for bragging rights, for technology's sake. You're doing it because you want to apply AI for socioeconomic development, for resilience, for public service delivery, right? So I'm really curious to see how all of these countries can kind of group together to, have interoperable, collaborative AI governance models, right? So I'm kind of working on a paper on that. And the second piece is around agents, because I think, you're talking about what's unique about this technology. It's transformative, and I think we haven't even scratched the surface of that till you see what agents can do. Highly autonomous, making decisions through their own kind of self-direction, with extremely useful contextual information, being able to influence their environment both digitally and physically, being able to do multi-step, multi-chain actions. I mean, it's going to be fascinating, right? And how we should be thinking about governance in this context and regulation, I think it's going to be a really interesting area.
When I think about just to follow on that, just the national databases of voter information or tax information or any of that stuff, when I think about agents suddenly being deployed there are going to be so many fascinating test cases across that. I'm having that thought. That's very interesting. Go ahead, Russell.
I was just going to say, I come from academia, so I spend a lot of time in that space. But one thing that I find most interesting, and it's not just to APAC, but broadly across the world, is AI is an enabling technology. And as such, what I'm most excited about is the scientific discovery that's going to happen from this. And we won't sit here and say it's an AI breakthrough, but it's a breakthrough that wouldn't have happened if you have AI and machine learning as a tool for this. And I'll give you a good example. The US a couple of years ago enjoyed a nuclear fusion breakthrough, but that wouldn't have happened if you didn't have AI to help advance the scientists. And we know that for a fact in terms of our engagement with them. Well, we call that a nuclear fusion breakthrough, not an AI breakthrough. I think that there's a lot of fertile ground across the world in terms of where certain industries, if you are a country that has a lead on a particular industry, I would really double down and I would find out how you are using that technology to be able to advance existing industries that you already have a lead in so you can maintain and keep that lead. That to me is, I think, going to be the most exciting thing, and where you're creating an investment for that and an ecosystem to allow for that. So scientific discovery and discovery in general with the tools of this technology will fundamentally transform humanity significantly. And the countries that are applying that and recognizing that moment, not chasing to be the frontier leader, but instead saying, where am I going to have that applied part, I think will do very well.
So on the same line of scientific discovery, one of the things that when you think about generative AI and agents and predictive modeling that has been around for now 20 years, one of the very good examples is a system that Google recently announced, Earth AI. And Earth AI puts together climate models that have been around for 20 years, and they have the historical data, in addition to generative AI that can understand natural language and respond in natural language, in addition to agents that they can plan and execute things with user supervision. So when we put these technologies together, they can solve really fundamental problems. And the example that I'm referring to, Earth AI, is a system that you can actually ask a first responder or a city manager can ask a question in natural language. For example, I'm seeing this hurricane from this area. What do we expect the path to be? And that kind of maps all of these predictive models and generative models, and also generating on top of that a map and show you the answer in natural language and in terms of like satellite images, in terms of like imagery. So the combination of this technology together can solve really big problems that we are dealing with, and city managers, governments, and first responders have an opportunity to kind of use this for responding quickly to the needs of their citizens. So that's what I'm really excited about.
Great. All right, let's get some questions from this esteemed crowd. I think we have a mic that's going to go around here. And so right here.
Thank you. Hi, very, very interesting discussion. I'm Denise Ang. I do partnerships for Gen AI for the Android mobile ecosystem. I used to work in the Singapore government, so really interesting to hear all your perspectives on Singapore. So for my question is, for the government, usually we have to be very prudent in terms of investments and management of resources for the public. So how would you, for the policymakers in government, what kind of principles or frameworks would you, that policymakers should consider, firstly, for how to prioritize domains or use cases to invest AI in, and secondly, how to define the ROI for such use cases that they invest in AI?
Can I respond to one of the questions? So one of the things that we recommended in one of our policy white papers is the question of identifying the problem that we should solve. And given that AI and the agentic technology has the ability to solve these problems, one of the things that governments can do is things like think about like what DARPA did in terms of autonomous vehicles. Way back, DARPA thought about this and put this as a challenge so that public can come together and solve the problem. So one of the ways that government can kind of encourage partnerships between academia, between industry, and between public sector is to identify these areas of importance. For example, that could be very different from, for an African country, it could be a problem in agriculture. But for the US, it could be a problem in space exploration. It very much is contextualized to the country. But the government has this role to identify those areas that are important for advancing and defining these things that kind of like public challenges or X prizes that encourages different players across industry, academia, and public sector to work together to solve that grand challenge.
So I take your question on a public sector approach specifically. And as such, I think what I just spoke about a moment ago on that scientific discovery, making sure, and as just noted, the grand challenge, the self-driverless car grand challenges, or things like that are helping advance that understanding and recognizing what your country might already be good at and where you can lead ahead on that. But the second part of that is, and one thing that we pushed for years ago and still continue to push for broadly in a US environment, but internationally, and that is computational resources and data resources for public sector use, or essentially AI for the public good. Right now, we have amazing companies doing amazing things, but there is still a profit motive and an area behind that, and there's a commercialization side. We need to ensure that academia still has a seat at the table and is actively part of this entire process, because that's where you're going to get the fundamental research that's going to eventually kind of spill over. That's from academia is where you get the internet, you get GPS, you get the MRI. All of these other fundamental parts of our society that we rely on did not come from industry. They were later commercialized and brought into our lives by industry, but the original ideas came from academic style research. So we have to deeply invest in that. And then I think, and to do that, we need to provide computational resources. The third thing that I think is really important is that governments seem to forget, and I think it's one of the most important things, is through procurement and the procurement process. That is a backdoor to regulation. That is actually an incentivizing way of regulation. Maybe there's a set of standards that are out there, and it's the Singaporean standards, and in that case, and the government will not purchase this technology to be utilized in the government and certain standardization. That is a very powerful tool by the government to actually incentivize instead of be restrictive in certain areas.
Yeah, just really good questions. I think on the use cases, kind of how do you define them? How do you prioritize them? I think India's had a very clear approach from the get-go, and this has come from Prime Minister Modi down, which is I want to link AI to Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so, we have 4 priority sectors. It's agriculture, healthcare, education, and governance, or public service delivery. Because I think in his mind, I don't care about AI, the technology as such, but if AI can increase agricultural productivity for farmers, I'm interested. If it can increase learning outcomes for high school students, I'm interested, right? So it's really about tangible improvements in these domains, and we will prioritize these domains that are linking up to Sustainable Development Goals. And I think just to the point, I think this is very contextual, right? This makes sense for India, these 4 priorities, but there could be different areas. Like as I'm doing my research in the South Asian regions, I realize Nepal, Bhutan, they're particularly interested in applying AI for disaster management, right? Because they're prone to earthquakes and floods, and Bangladesh for floods and so on. So it's very contextual, right? And very different, I think, in the global north, in the developed world. And then 2, I think on your point about ROI, I think it's going to be a very important question as companies make these huge kind of infrastructure bets. And I think to Russell's point about procurement, I think we're going to have to experiment with different models. Governments are going to have to experiment with different models for how do you acquire kind of compute and data. India, for example, was thinking about different ways to acquire these advanced GPUs to allow researchers in India to build these frontier models. And we played around with a few models, but I think where we've arrived at is to say, look, the government doesn't need to procure these expensive GPUs, right, at market rates. So what we'll do is let the market, like the private market, acquire GPUs in the way that it makes sense, and we'll empanel certain service providers. We'll authorize or recognize certain of these companies as authorized service providers, and we'll subsidize compute access to researchers and startups, right? So we'll pay some of these companies, 40% of their market rates. So as opposed to acquiring 20,000 NVIDIA GPUs at market rates, let the market decide, and we'll subsidize them. And I think that is actually going to get much closer to a value, like a useful kind of ROI. And that's just one model that India's adopted, but there'll be plenty others.
Stupid question here as a follow-up to this. Am I right that if you build adequate capacity, you don't have to tailor that capacity to the 4 different sectors that you're talking about, right? Education, agriculture, governance. You don't need a separate compute bucket for that. You can, in theory, build a minimum capacity and hand it out as needed to these things. Is there any sense yet of sort of what the bare minimum is? You know what I mean? Do you think that will we pretty soon get to a place where people say, where a country moving into this for the first time says, oh, we're going to need this amount in order to make the difference we want to?
That's dependent on what type of model you're building. If you're at a frontier level trying to build something with in the billions of parameters and way up there, then you could be talking about at a minimum a 10,000 GPU access for a training run over quite a few weeks. I would say
What if it's the applied one that you're talking about? If we're not building our own
The bigger part on that on compute are two things. One is the broad need for everyone, and I think that's what we need to be careful about when we're understanding compute. OpenAI, Google, well, you guys have TPUs, but you're going to need massive amounts to be able to do these frontier areas. But the other part is the rest of the world has woken up that AI is the new form of compute. It is the new form of being able to do things. And so you're going to need access to that in some capacity. So maybe you're not using 10,000 GPUs under continuous use, but you are going to need some areas for whether it's research, whether it's startups, a variety of companies that might need them. So I think it's a difficult question in that sense. And then the other part of this is it's inference. And so you're going to need to be able to be calling on the compute on a regular basis. So it's not just training runs, it's the inference aspects of this. So I don't have a number for you because that's quite difficult to quantify. But I think that this push towards compute is, I think, an inevitability. There is no way that you're going to be able to satisfy the demands of any frontier kind of research on top of applied research and then on top of the inference that you're going to need.
So if you want a number, don't quote me on this, but what I've heard is the Indian government will be providing one of the startups 5,000 GPUs for a period of 4 months. I don't know if that's building from scratch or fine-tuning, but at least that's what they have for training. And then to the point about, I think you raised an important point about if you're doing inference at scale, how many GPUs is that going to require? We don't even know, right? So we'll just have to wait and watch.
Let me
just quickly, just so because we only have 10 minutes left, I just want to make sure we get other people's questions, if that's okay. Yes, sir. Let's go with this one right here. Blazer.
Hi, thank you. This is Nihar Shah with Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and I work with the Department of Energy. So one of the things, I think energy tends to be a big blind spot in this conversation. So if you could talk a little bit, I think you mentioned, the idea that industry can kind of take this on first and see how far we go in order to maximize innovation. Can you just talk through the different views that you've seen out there, and how are you thinking about this problem? How is industry thinking about it? How are governments thinking about it? And what have you seen out there? Is it still a blind spot, or are they thinking about it carefully, saying, okay, well, this is the best way to? Has someone discovered that?
I mean, here in the United States, just to set it up here, I was at a gathering of of rural electricity providers, and those people were absolutely blindsided. They had no idea what was coming, and so the idea that, here in the U.S., it's a blind spot. I can't even imagine what it must be in a country that is trying to build this out of whole cloth for the very first time.
So for the data center developers, they're quite clear on the energy needs and the demands. In fact, I just a couple of weeks ago had a helicopter ride over in Abu Dhabi over the Stargate data center, of which one of the unique benefits of why they're able to have that is because right next to that will look like an ocean, and it was not an ocean, it was a sea of solar panels to be able to feed into that kind of thing. So the energy issue will be significant. And I won't say too much here, but this is about a little over a year ago. I had a briefing with a U.S. national security group, just to say that, and they said, it's interesting, when we started talking about the energy and the consumption areas, challenges, one of the officials said, if the U.S. embassy in India has constant brownouts, how will they ever be able to be a frontier leader? And this was, a year and a half ago, so this feels like decades ago in AI. But it was just that realization of, can certain countries ever be a frontier leader if they're not going to even have the means of the energy to talk about that? And there is issues now of the U.S.-China race here about whether China is much more advanced on energy grids and gotten further along, and I think it's going to compel the U.S. to step up.
Maybe we can talk about it after the panel, but one thing that I would flag for you to look into is that the question is, what is the ultimate source of energy? Infinite, sun. So how can we capture the energy of sun for enabling this data centers? So what if we push the data center a little bit up in the space? And recently, Google announced this project Suncatcher. I will share a link for you. It would be interesting for you to take a look at. How can we benefit from this infinite amount of energy without kind of the being completely reliant on terrestrial energy. So I'll share a link with you.
From what I'm hearing, you're still a blind spot, is the vibe I get. So, yeah. You had your hand up there with your glasses on, right? Yep. Maybe take the mic so that people in the live stream can hear you as well. Thank you so much.
Well, throughout the discussion, I think you were, in terms of discussing regulation and like where you will look for the future, you're making this division between the underlying technology and applications. So as consumers, I think we're probably still dealing with, we obviously do not develop the underlying, whether it's processing power GPUs or the algorithms that generate answers for the chatbots. So what's not clear to me is, do you see an application that we can see today is ChatGPT or Google Gemini? Are these applications or are they underlying technologies?
In that case, that's a developer and a deployer. They're doing both. They've provided a product to you that's you're utilizing. But what I was referring to earlier is the actual what happens at the level of the development of the model itself, the research, the engagement, what it takes to build that model. The next question is the layer of the productizing and putting out in society. And there's been calls that are quite significant in terms of not even you releasing the model, but building the model would actually have a regulatory framework. I personally, from what I can tell and what I'm seeing in terms of data, that's frankly, it's counterproductive. I don't think it's actually going to prevent areas of concern that we are talking about. And it's generally informed by, let's just say, not really rigorous science in the space about that. My philosophy on this has been, let people develop what they're going to develop, but when it's deployed, who is responsible and what are the issues related to that? That part of I think is what needs to be regulated in that specific space. That is the most important part to me. So it's not the research and development side, it is the deployment side of that and when it meets the consumer or the user in that capacity.
Let's jam in one quick short one. Who's got one that you think we could actually get to the bottom of? You think so? All right, right here. Go ahead. The mic's right behind you there.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for the discussion. Very valuable insights. Quick question. So we talked about Russell. You mentioned some countries being the tech frontier, innovator, leaders, and then pushing that, and then for some other countries that a lot of you mentioned, we hear about the regulations that they're trying to push through and innovate through, innovate regulations to catch up with the tech. So we typically hear China about leading sort of the tech and being in the news, like you mentioned DeepSeek. Where are they with the regulation and what's their approach with the regulation and what is its effect compared to other countries in terms of leading with the tech?
So China actually has a lot of robust regulations that people don't spend too much time talking about. Now, there's a variety, and over the years, they've had a few that have come out. So on recommender systems, I think it was in 2022, I think that they had some come out. And I think in 2023 was their Gen AI one. On the Gen AI one, frankly, what I see out a lot of that is regime protection versus and fear of the technology. And so on that part, and the bigger issue though is the enforcement on that. And the issue, from what I understand on the Chinese side, the enforcement is it's not like the EU where the enforcement is very clear and decisive. The enforcement isn't there, but there are parts that exist within China, and compared to the US, the Chinese are by far more engaged and have regulatory frameworks.
If anything, I mean, the CEO of one of these companies has personal legal liability if the model is misused in some way that the government determines. In a way, what I would argue is that you only have to enforce that once or twice before nobody messes with that rule again, right? And so there's something to me about that and what Russell's saying there.
They recently amended their cybersecurity law.
Let me just jump in, just because no one else can hear you other than those on the mic. So thank you so much. Let's talk afterwards. You guys, what a fantastic gathering. Let's thank Google for hosting us, the Asia Society for putting us together, and all of you for being here. Thank you so much.
Let's also make sure we thank all the speakers, Jacob, Ellie, Amlan, and Russell. You took us through a lot. Yes, clap, please. You took us through a lot, and it's a fast-moving target. I didn't realize the impact of AI on the nuclear fusion breakthrough. Thank you for sharing that, Russell. We actually honored Tammy Ma at the Lawrence Livermore Lab, and we've done tours of that. So it's just nice to thread all of this with everything that we do at Asia Society. So how many of you are Asia Society members, by the way? Okay, thank you, thank you. We need more hands next time. I do also want to thank the Consular Corps reps and the economies that are here. We have with us Korea, Philippines, Japan, China, the U.S. Commerce Department as well, and Hong Kong. So please mix and mingle. We're going to have a reception right here for about half an hour, a few upcoming programs, especially for the members. We are going to the Monkey King, and we're doing a behind the scenes at the opera next week on November 20th. A China Business Council Conundrum event on December 16th. Wendy Cutler and James Green is going to be back with us. That's going to be on December 18th in San Francisco. We're hosting a big annual US-China conference on January 22nd. You're not going to want to miss that. You heard how much China was brought up. We're going to be diving into all of it there. We have our gala on April 23rd. And to our Seattle friends who are joining us online, December 3rd, we're doing a SAM talk at the Seattle Asian Art Museum. So thank you very much again for joining us out here. Thank you to Google. Thank you to James. Thank you to Nicole. Thank you to our team. Please wave Christy, Margaret, Evan, Jason, Paul online, all of our incredible volunteers. See you at the next event and enjoy our reception. Thank you.